I'm just briefly going to share with you a couple of things that over the last 10 years we've found to be quite effective in mainstreaming biodiversity into the development agenda. So we're a country with a huge amount of biodiversity, third most biodiverse country in the world. While South Africa's got a pretty solid foundation in protected areas, we don't have a representative protected area network. We've still got a lot to do in terms of increasing our coverage, and especially in the marine environment, which sits at 0.1% at the moment. So in South Africa, we're trying to develop a stronger sense of connection between people, people's health, our existence, and the foundations that we draw from in healthy ecosystems. And we're trying to also instill a longer-term planning horizon beyond the usual 5-year planning horizon. First, we need to know where are our biodiversity assets, and where the important areas are for delivery of ecosystem services. We've also got a huge jobless rate, 25%, which is 4.4 million people. And what we've been doing is showing through pilot studies of ecosystem restoration, not only the benefits around water purification, water supply, but also the intensive manual labor that it requires. Over the last few years, we've created 11,000 jobs per year in ecosystem restoration. And this is really starting to get the attention of senior policymakers at the national level, but also right down to the municipal level, starting to see that there are multiple benefits that flow from restoration of critical ecosystems, not only the jobs, the water benefits, but increasingly flood attenuation and other disaster risk reduction. Also, as part of moving beyond GDP, we're in that conversation, we're pursuing a suite of ecosystem accounts. They're experimental ecosystem accounts. We're one of the 7 pilot countries that's involved with this. We're first focusing on river accounts, and what we're really hoping through this is to be able to increase the appreciation among policymakers of the value of healthy, intact ecosystems in delivering on the country's many development challenges. We also, as SANBI, have realized we've got to do quite a lot more around communicating the value of biodiversity in a much more positive light. I think as a sector in South Africa and across the globe, we've really scored a number of own goals around the way we consistently talk about the doom and gloom stories, and it doesn't inspire anyone, possibly only the biodiversity sector, but no one beyond the biodiversity sector is inspired by tales of woe. And we've put quite a lot of effort into understanding how to communicate stories of hope into the development agenda.
As chairman of APRA, I'm humbled by this opportunity to share with you how our company has been able to conserve 250,000 hectares of high conservation value forests, while at the same time establishing plantations that surround it to protect it. And in the process, we created 90,000 jobs, and some of them are involved in a replanting program every year, which, the people plants close to 160 million trees per year. Our experience is that in the developing world where poverty is prevalent, it is much better for a private company to come in, and manage it in a sustainable way so that we can protect high conservation value forests. In the process, we have conserved 250,000 hectares of land. It is protected day after day, and we are determined to continue to protect it. And of course, in the process, we create 90,000 jobs, which helps elevate the poverty in that area.
How come your company, your investment has been very different to what we normally have seen in many developing countries, where we tend to believe that there has been an institutional failure? So investors does not have the right institutional and policy conditions for being successful, as in the case that you presented to us.
Well, I think we all hope that the government works and has a proper framework of governance. But the lack of it does not give an excuse to business to act irresponsibly. And the business has to see itself as a business that makes sense. And APRA operates very much on the founder's value. When you make profit, you make sure you look after your people, you make sure you look after the planet. You have to do what is good for the country, what is good for the community, what is good for the conservation. Then it is good for the company. We conserve more than 10%. We conserve up to 30, 40%. Because we see that as a responsibility on the part of company to contribute back to society, to contribute back to nature, what we have taken from it. The other thing is that by acting responsibly, we are also exerting our influence on other people. We continue to use mixed hardwood, not from our own forests, but from our supply partners, right? These are the people who also have concession license to convert, production forests to plantations. When we work with them, we say, you have to apply the same standards. You have to do HCVF. And they are interested to do it because they can then sell the wood to us. So whatever wood that is taken from them are not from high conservation value forests. But because of our ability to exert our influence, we ended up helping environment conserve more forests. The alternative for them, if we don't work with them, is simply cut everything. Follow the legal requirements. And what do they do with the wood? They either bury it, and the country loses because you loses tax revenue as a result of it, or they burn it. And the world loses because when you burn, you create haste. And as a Singaporean, I suffer the consequences of it ever so often. When the city is blanketed by fires from Indonesia.
I'm curious on how you've been able to achieve this when one of the problems you're reflecting here on lack of management is in part due to lack of governance. So how can a company can really be successful in achieving all these standards where I presume there's a lack of governance, and I most probably will come with some questions associated to that. And I encourage participants as well to do this. Valerie, the floor is yours.
Besu just gave us a wonderful example of how far the private sector is coming in terms of thinking about how to go beyond a measure of its own value in terms of just income and changing its bottom line to really think about wealth more broadly, to include a capture of natural capital, the importance of natural capital. And this is a struggle that we've been discussing and debating at the World Bank for many years, for over a decade now, is how do we move beyond GDP as a measure of well-being? How do we really begin to think about wealth more broadly? Wealth that, yes, includes attention to income. We all need money. But also includes attention to human capital, to education, to health, and for our purposes, most importantly, to natural capital. How do we move beyond GDP? And that's what I wanted to spend a few minutes on today. Because at the bank, we're really interested in talking about a growth that's evergreen. We want to make sure countries are growing, but we want to make sure that as they alleviate poverty, as they begin to boost shared prosperity, and the bottom 40% in every country begins to gain access to many of the benefits that the top 60%, most of us sitting around here today, have been able to access for a long time, that their ability to share in that prosperity is not short-term. It's not a visitor visa into prosperity, but a permanent visa, that people are not falling back into poverty. And our experience shows us that unless we take into account natural capital, then the shared prosperity and the poverty alleviation we're achieving is precarious at best. So that's why at the World Bank we've been working on natural capital accounting as one way to begin to think about how we take into account the value of natural capital and take it into account in a way that provides us the language where we can very easily connect environmental data to economic data using the language of jobs and GDP. We all know at the end of the day, the key decision makers, be they reptilian, as Carlos mentioned this morning, the ministers of finance, the ministers of planning, They talk the language of accounting. They talk the language of economics and of finance. That's a language we need to learn, and NCA is our thesaurus in many ways to get us in there. NCA is based on an internationally agreed methodology that was agreed in 2012 by the UN system of accounting. And so now it's a consensus-driven system of accounts, the UN system of environmental economic accounts. And it moves us from being able to think about natural capital, nature, and protected areas in our case, as being a cost sink. Something that, okay, maybe a Minister of Finance every now and again will put some money into, but they see it as somewhere that it's about sunk costs. To turn that into something where we think about protected areas and about nature more broadly as an investment asset, as something that we invest in, as something that attracts investment, not just charity. It'll allow us to move from being the constituency of no, which sometimes the environmental constituency is concerned. Sometimes people think we're all about saying no, no, you can't build that there, no, sorry, that road can't go through there. Sorry, no, we don't want you giving jobs over here because it'll mean some of our parks disappear. Really into a constituency of yes, we can. We can help you manage those trade-offs. We can provide you the data that will allow you to have a free, prior, and informed negotiation of the very real trade-offs that our colleagues in the Ministries of Finance and Planning have to deal with every day. As they try and alleviate poverty, as they try and grow their economy so that more people can come out of poverty, there are very real trade-offs. That's what this entire stream is about. And NCA is a way of providing the data and the information in a way that's readily understandable so that those ministries of finance can begin to negotiate those trade-offs with a focus on the poor first, particularly because at the end of the day, nature is the GDP of the poor.
Kering is a French company that owns 22 brands, some of which you'll know quite well, like Gucci and Bottega Veneta, Balenciaga, Stella McCartney, Alexander McQueen. I help support all the brands as they move to being more sustainable. The reasons behind why Kering wants to be a more sustainable company are linked back to both leadership at the very highest level of the company, where the chairman and CEO fundamentally believes that a more sustainable business is a more successful business. There's also a real recognition that there are great opportunities in being a more sustainable business opportunities, and that there's also risk mitigation and reputational value and a whole lot of factors behind why Kering wants to be a more sustainable company. The way we measure and look at our progress to being a more sustainable company is through two different things. Firstly, we have public targets that we have set and we've announced. In 2012, we announced targets such as that our leather would come from verified responsible sources. We also have a second sort of mechanism for us to measure and assess our progress to being a more sustainable company through what's called an environment profit and loss, which Valerie mentioned. An environment profit and loss account was actually pioneered by Puma in 2010. We've now taken that methodology and refined it and expanded it and have rolled it out across now 75% of our business. Now, what an EP&L is basically a corporate level natural capital account. What an EP&L tries to do is look across the entire supply chain of a company like Kering and really assess, okay, where are the impacts on nature, and where are the opportunities, and where in those supply chains, not only where in the supply chain, but geographically also where are those impacts. So it helps us sort of get a picture of our supply chain. Now, for a company like Kering, it's a little different to a company like April, because our impacts, we have diffuse global supply chain. A lot of our products are made in Italy and are made in Europe. But our raw materials come from all over the world, like a lot of companies. So understanding where our impacts are is a really significant step. So when you do that, using a natural capital account, like an EP&L, when you do that analysis, for some surprisingly, for others not surprisingly, the majority of our impact, or between 40 and 50% of our impact, our footprint, if you like, is at raw material production and extraction. So what are we going to do? We want to then find solutions. We want to find ways of sourcing those raw materials that are more sustainable, that not only reduce our footprint and reduce our EPNL, our environment profit and loss account, and for Puma in 2010 it was 145 million euros a year in impact to the environment. The challenge is actually figuring out how to do that. And I would say the challenge is, even if you get a company, so you get a company like ours to this point where we've acknowledged there's an impact of our diverse and global supply chains, we're committed to making a difference and to improving that. What exactly does that look like on the ground? What does sustainable production of merino wool look like? And how in that the sustainable production can we ensure that broader landscape impacts are taken into consideration? So it's not just the production of a particular farm, that to make sure that it's not drawing on water from a watershed where water scarcity is becoming more and more of a problem. At the company level, we need people to help us. We need scientists and conservation to help us define and identify, define, and verify what a sustainable production looks like for particular raw materials that we want to produce or extract. What do we need to do to make our footprint better, and also to create opportunities to actually restore natural capital and not just draw down on natural capital. So I think that the work that Crystal is doing and her team is really interesting, because that is the sort of work at a regional level or country level that's going to show, look, here's the ecosystem service value of this landscape and this area, and by doing this or that, you're going to impact it or enhance it or whatever, and that will help drive decisions and help inform, not drive so much as inform decisions about how do you create a sustainable production. And then companies like mine can come and say, great, that's what we want to buy that, we want that, and we want the data and the information that you have so we can put it into our natural capital account and show what we're doing towards natural capital. For us, the challenge is identifying, defining, and verifying what sustainable production looks like. A sustainable production that incorporates biodiversity, protected areas, and long-term value of natural capital.
Many economists has labeled Malaysia as one of the few countries who have successfully transitioned from an independent state to where we are today. Our poverty rates are very low. We are 1.5% of the population is under poverty. We are one of the advanced developing states. We have got a grand vision to be a fully developed nation by 2020. And we are guided by three long policy perspectives. When we got our independence in 1970, much of our society, our people were poor, highly divided. As you know, Malaysia is truly Asia. We've got Indians, we've got Malays, we've got Chinese. They were highly divided. So the first priority of the government then was to eradicate poverty. And we inherited a system of plantation. We had palm oil, we had the rubber, and the government consciously established this thing called Federal Land Development Authority to open new areas of forests to plant palm oil and rubber in a pretext of giving new economic incentives to the rural community and take them from the crutches of poverty, and that's been successful. FELDA, the short name for the Federal Land Development, has been a model that's been cited by many as a successful model where natural resources was used in a sustainable manner to eradicate poverty. And that was the new economic policy which ran from 1970 to 1990. And then in 1990, we embraced the manufacturing world. We were not so reliant on natural resources, although natural resources was important. But Malaysia moved on to be one of the world's biggest producers for electronics, and now we are one of the our economy is driven mainly by services. I think in the whole global, and I am glad that Valerie brought it up, in this whole global debate about development, I think environment has got the least priority, and I think the discussion now in Malaysia is to interject environment and social concerns as a measurement of development. I think something that many countries are also talking about, a measurement beyond GDP. And in 2004, we came out with a plan called the Common Vision on Biodiversity, which has got a three-prong approach, which is to strengthen protected areas, because we consciously know protected area is a very important frontier for biodiversity and ecosystem services. We wanted to mainstream biodiversity in all sectors, and we wanted to use landscape, seascape management. And through that approach, we have been able to do a small in size, but big in its information it's going to give policymakers. Malaysia is about 60% still under forest cover, which out of it, 10% is totally protected. This figures will, of course, has a lot more opportunity to grow because we have got 50% forest cover. And on the Borneo side, companies like April, but of course in Malaysia we have our own palm oil companies, are doing linkaging corridors. And we've got this big Heart of Borneo project supported by WWF. And in Peninsular Malaysia, we're also linking our big chunks of protected areas through a grand project called Central Forest Pine. And we are thankful to Jeff and UNDP for supporting a 6-year project, which is trying to connect these corridors to create connectivity, of course, just not for wildlife, but also for flora and the total biodiversity conservation. Everybody knows what biodiversity is, I think, I hope so, but it's the attitude and the practice that's not changing. And this is something that we have to do and work on. And Malaysia, in that scenario, what we tried to do is, Malaysia has got unique biodiversity. We've got the world's oldest tropical rainforest. We are home to some of the most charismatic species. The Malayan tiger is found in only Malaysia. It's a unique subspecies. So in 2012, we unveiled a kind of branding for biodiversity. We tried to steal something from the corporate world, you know, how powerful brands like Coke, Sony, and Puma captivates people by just their brands. We thought Malaysia's biodiversity needs a brand. And you know, we took this innovative approach that Malaysia's URL is .com.my. So we said, my biodiversity is my life, my heritage, my future. But on a global scale, there's total lack of effort on biodiversity. In 2010, when we met, we had biodiversity targets, and we didn't achieve them. We now have IG targets, and only yesterday the executive secretary of the CBD said, most likely we're not going to achieve and much of it. It's been a long time since we heard any world leaders even mentioning the word biodiversity. It's been a long time. Climate change is there, but biodiversity, and that's the central focus of protected areas. And that's something that needs to come back. And why I'm bringing this, because it has to transpose back to countries which are mega diverse like Malaysia. And this is something that I think needs to happen, and I'm glad again to the World Bank, and I don't know how is World Bank going to do it, to bring the other pillars of sustainable development, social agenda, the environment agenda, to say that conservation is not an impediment to development, but it's a prerequisite for well-being and sustainability.